The warehouse hummed with that low, steady rhythm I live for. It was 11:51 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was standing on the loading dock, checking a manifest for a shipment of steel coils when my phone lit up against the cold concrete. It wasn't a client. It was a text from my mother, Sarah. 7 words that slashed through the noise of the facility. You are no longer welcome in this family. I didn't even have time to blink before the second notification popped up. My sister, Brittany, had hearted the message. A coordinated strike. I stood there, surrounded by pallets of freight, the smell of ozone and diesel filling my lungs. Tears are a luxury for people who don't run 24-hour operations. I didn't shed a single one. I just stared at the screen and realized that the war I had been trying to avoid had finally arrived at my dock. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from right now, and if you've ever received a text that changed your entire life in 1 second. I want to know I'm not the only one. A normal reaction would involve tissues and a frantic phone call to a best friend. But I don't work in normals. I work in metrics. In logistics, when a vendor violates the terms of service, you don't send them a sad letter, you terminate the contract. I walked over to my desk, the steel-toed boots heavy on the floor, and opened my laptop. The screen glowed with the familiar blue of my inventory management system. But tonight, I wasn't managing freight. I was managing liability. I started with the basics. I logged in to the shared family cloud account. For 10 years, I had paid the storage fees for 50,000 photos, tax documents, and digital memories. I clicked settings, selected my payment method, and hit remove. Then came the streaming services. It sounds petty, but access is a currency. They had been living in a house built on my subscriptions. Netflix, Hulu, premium music accounts, I canceled every single one. I watched the active users list shrink from 4 names down to 1. But those were just warning shots. The real ammunition was in the banking portal. My parents, Sarah and David, liked to project the image of successful real estate moguls. The reality was much thinner. They lived commission to commission, leasing luxury cars to drive clients around, wearing clothes they couldn't afford. 3 years ago, during a dry spell in the market, I had co-signed a commercial line of credit for their business. It was a $60,000 safety net meant for emergencies. Over time, it had become their lifestyle fund. I pulled up the statement. They were currently using $42,000 of the available credit. I looked at the transaction history, leased BMW payments, high-end dinners, a boutique hotel stay for Brittany's mental health weekend. They weren't using my credit for business. They were using it to maintain the illusion that they didn't need me. I didn't feel guilty. I felt like an auditor discovering embezzlement. I navigated to the guarantor settings. The terms were clear. As the primary account holder, I had the right to freeze the asset at any time to prevent further debt. I didn't hesitate. I typed in my password. A confirmation box popped up asking if I was sure. I clicked yes. Then I initiated a transfer of the debt responsibility back to the secondary signers, them. Without my credit score backing the account, the bank's algorithm would immediately flag the risk and lock the funds. It took exactly 12 minutes to dismantle the financial infrastructure of their lives. I closed the laptop and sat back in the silence of the warehouse. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a text. It was an automated alert from the bank app. Transaction declined. The Cheesecake Factory. $180. They were out celebrating my exile with a dinner I was supposed to pay for. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The contract was terminated. The shipment was rejected. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one paying the bill. To understand why I froze their accounts with zero hesitation, you have to understand the garage. We call it the dead stock. 2 weeks ago, I drove out to my parents' house in the suburbs. The lawn was manicured, the hedges were trimmed to a perfect geometrical precision. Everything about Sarah and David was about curb appeal. But when my father hit the button for the 3-car garage, the illusion shattered. Inside, stacked floor to ceiling in disorganized cardboard towers, was about $80,000 worth of the Brittany brand Brittany, my 28-year-old sister, had tried everything. First, it was the organic candle business. Then, the high-end athleisure line. Then, the curated subscription boxes for mindful living. Each venture followed the same cycle. My parents put up the capital. Brittany hired a branding agency to make a pretty logo. She hosted a launch party, and then nothing. She had no distribution strategy, no inventory control, and no work ethic. She liked the aesthetic of being a CEO, but she hated the logistics of actually running a business. We were sitting at the dining room table mahogany, polished to a shine that felt accusationally bright. My mother pushed a plate of dry chicken toward me and smiled that tight, political smile of hers. Brittany has a new vision, she said. A boutique logistics firm. High-end personal shopping for executives. I almost choked on my water. Logistics? I asked. Mom, Brittany can't even track her own Amazon returns. Brittany glared at me from across the table, tapping her manicured nails on the wood. It's a consulting agency, Jordan. You wouldn't get it. You deal with dirty warehouses. I'm dealing with luxury procurement. We need seed capital, my father interrupted, cutting to the chase. 60,000, just to get the website and the initial inventory secured. He didn't ask. He stated it. Like it was a line item on an invoice I was obligated to pay. I put my fork down. Let me get this straight. You want me to invest $60,000 into a business run by someone who currently has 40 grand of unsold leggings rotting in the garage next to 50 crates of unscented candles? That's not an investment. That's a donation to a landfill. The silence in the room was instant and cold. My mother's smile vanished. It's not rotting, it's appreciating vintage stock. She lied, her voice trembling with that specific mix of delusion and defense. And we aren't asking for a donation. We're asking you to support your sister. You have the money. You just bought that second facility. I bought that facility because it generates revenue, I said, keeping my voice flat. I run a business based on margins and efficiency. Brittany runs a charity for her own ego. And you're the donors. I'm not joining the board. You're jealous, Brittany spat out, standing up. You've always been jealous because I have vision and you're just a worker. I'm solvent. I corrected. And you're a liability. I left that night without finishing dinner. As I backed out of the driveway, I watched the garage door slowly close, sealing the tomb of failed ideas back into darkness. I knew then that they weren't just asking for help. They were looking for a new host to attach themselves to because they had bled themselves dry. I wasn't a daughter to them anymore. I was a liquidity event. And tonight, reviewing the frozen credit lines on my screen, I knew I had made the right call. I don't fund hobbies, and I definitely don't finance people who despise the hands that sign the checks. 3 days later, the escalation arrived, not via text, but via a process server standing awkwardly next to a forklift. He looked out of place in his cheap suit against the backdrop of shipping containers and sweating dock workers. He asked for Jordan. I signed the clipboard with the same pen I used to sign for hazardous materials. He handed me a thick manila envelope and left. I didn't open it immediately. I walked back to my office, poured a black coffee, and sat down. Then I slit the seal. Summons and complaint. The plaintiffs were Sarah and David. The amount demanded was $900,000. I started reading my eyes, scanning the legal jargon with the same detached focus I use for a customs audit. The accusations were breathtaking in their creativity. Count 1, theft of intellectual property. They claimed that my logistics firm, a company built on proprietary software and complex supply chain algorithms, was actually based on a business concept Brittany had discussed at a family Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago. According to the complaint, Brittany had orally conveyed the foundational idea of a premium shipping consultancy, which I had then misappropriated for personal gain. I almost laughed. Brittany thinks logistics is what happens when UPS delivers her packages on time. The idea that she engineered a global freight network over turkey and stuffing was objectively insane, but count 2 was darker, undue influence. They alleged that I had manipulated my great-aunt Eleanor, who had passed away 2 years ago, into cutting them out of her estate. They claimed I had isolated the decedent and poisoned her mind to secure the $90,000 inheritance that I had used to start my business. I put the papers down and looked out the window at the trucks lining up at the bays. A normal person would feel betrayed. A normal daughter would ask, how could they do this? But I wasn't looking at this like a daughter. I was looking at it like an investor. And suddenly, it made perfect sense. In business, there is a concept called the sunk cost fallacy. It's when an investor pours so much money into a failing project that they refuse to cut their losses. Instead, they keep throwing good money after bad, terrified to admit that their initial investment was a mistake. Britney was their failing project. For 28 years, Sarah and David had invested everything, their money, their ego, their identity, into the idea that Britney was the special one, the star. To admit she was a failure would mean admitting that they were failures. They couldn't do that. The psychological bankruptcy would be too high. So, they needed a bailout. They looked at me, the child they had ignored, the safe investment they had never bothered to fund, and they didn't see a daughter. They saw a liquidity event. They were suing me to tax my competence so they could subsidize their delusion. They weren't trying to get justice. They were trying to cover their margin call. I picked up the phone. I didn't call my parents. I dialed Nathaniel, the most aggressive corporate fraud attorney in the city. Nathaniel, I said when he picked up, I have a hostile takeover attempt on my desk. I need you to kill it. Who's the opposing party? He asked. My creators, I said. Start the clock. I didn't hire a family law attorney. Family lawyers talk about mediation and reconciliation. I hired Nathaniel, a litigator who specializes in corporate espionage and hostile takeovers. His office was on the 42nd floor, a glass box suspended over the city, smelling of espresso and billable hours. They're alleging you manipulated an elderly woman with dementia, Nathaniel said, scrolling through the digital evidence file on the wall-mounted screen. Standard predatory tactic. They want to invalidate the will, so the estate enters probate again. If they win, they drain your accounts. If they lose, they hope you'll settle just to stop the bleeding. I don't bleed, I said, sliding a black external hard drive across the polished mahogany table. And Aunt Eleanor didn't have dementia. She had a strategy. Aunt Eleanor had been the black sheep of the family long before I took up the mantle. She was a woman who had built her own wealth in real estate during a time when banks required a husband's signature for a loan. She died 2 years ago, leaving me $90,000 and a collection of encrypted digital files. The family thought she was paranoid. I knew she was just prepared. Nathaniel plugged the drive in. What are we looking for? File 001, labeled contingency, I said. The screen flickered, and suddenly Aunt Eleanor was looking down at us from the grave. She was sitting in her high-backed leather chair, a cigarette burning in the ashtray next to her, a habit she refused to quit because, as she put it, at 80, everything is a health risk. Jordan, the video version of Eleanor began, her voice raspy but razor sharp. If you are watching this, it means Sarah and David have finally run out of other people's money. It means the parasite has turned on the host. Nathaniel stopped typing. The room went dead silent. They will call you selfish, Eleanor continued, staring directly into the camera lens. They will say you stole from them. They will say I was senile when I signed the checks. Don't believe them. And more importantly, don't pity them. She took a drag of the cigarette. Your parents are not bad people because they are evil. They are bad people because they are weak. They eat their young to keep themselves fed. They did it to me 40 years ago, and I let them. I paid their debts until I was nearly bankrupt. I don't want you to make the same mistake. She leaned forward. This $90,000 I left you, it isn't a gift, Jordan. It isn't for a down payment or a vacation. It is a war chest. I am giving you the ammunition I wish I had when I was your age. Build a fortress so high they can never climb over the walls. And when they come knocking, and they will come knocking, you keep the gates shut. The video ended. The screen went black. I sat there, the hum of the hard drive, the only sound in the room. For years, I had thought the inheritance was just kindness. I realized now it was tactical. Eleanor hadn't just given me capital, she had given me clearance. She had anticipated the supply chain failure of this family decades before I was even born. Nathaniel looked at me, a rare smile touching his lips. "That," he said, tapping the desk, "is the most effective character witness I have ever seen. We aren't just going to win the dismissal, Jordan. We are going to bury them." I looked at the black screen where Eleanor's face had been. I didn't feel grief. I felt armed. "Let's move to discovery," I said. "I want to see exactly how desperate they are." Discovery is usually the most tedious part of a lawsuit. It is weeks of sifting through thousands of emails, receipts, and bank statements, looking for a needle in a haystack of irrelevance. But 2 weeks into the process, Nathaniel called me. He didn't ask me to come to his office next week. He told me to come now. When I walked into the conference room, the mood had shifted. The air didn't smell like expensive coffee anymore. It smelled like blood in the water. Nathaniel didn't greet me. He just pointed to a single document centered on the glass table. "We subpoenaed your sister's personal banking records to prove financial distress," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet. "We found a series of transfers from a regional bank account we didn't know existed, so we pulled the origin documents for that account." I looked down. It was a loan application from 3 years ago. The header read, "Small Business Expansion Loan." The amount was $72,000. The applicant's name was Jordan Vance. I frowned. I didn't take out a loan 3 years ago. I cash flowed the expansion of the Western Distribution Center. "Keep reading," Nathaniel said. I looked at the signature line. There was my name. The handwriting was a skilled attempt at mimicry, practiced and careful. But the loop on the J was too wide. The slant was too vertical. It was the handwriting of someone who had spent her life trying to copy me, but never quite getting the mechanics right. It was Brittany's hand. My eyes slid to the right. A loan application requires a witness or a notary to verify the identity of the signer. There, stamped in fading blue ink, was the official seal. Sarah Vance. Commission expires 2024. The room seemed to tilt. My mother hadn't just known about the fraud, she had notarized it. She had sat at a table, watched her favorite daughter forge my name to steal $72,000 of credit, and then stamped it with her state-issued seal to make it legal. "It gets worse," Nathaniel said, sliding a second sheet of paper across the table. "Look at the repayment schedule." I scanned the dates. The loans were structured with a 3-year interest-only period, followed by a balloon payment of the full principal. The balloon payment was due next month. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with the force of a freight train. The lawsuit, the $900,000 demand, the timing. It wasn't about Aunt Eleanor. It wasn't about undue influence. It was a desperate, panicked cover-up. They were about to default on the fraudulent loans. If they missed the payment, the bank would come after the signatory me. I would find out about the theft immediately, they would go to prison, they needed cash, and they needed it fast. They sued me not because they thought they were right, but because they needed to extract a settlement large enough to pay off the crime they had committed in my name before the bank called me. I looked up at Nathaniel. The anger I expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, I felt a cold, metallic clarity. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It wasn't even a civil case. "This is identity theft," I said, my voice steady. "This is wire fraud. This is bank fraud." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "This is federal prison." I looked at the forged signature one last time. For 30 years, I had wondered how far they would go to protect Brittany. Now I had the answer. They would commit a felony. "Draft the referral to the FBI," I said, "but don't send it yet. I want to look them in the eye when they realize the trap has snapped shut." The settlement conference took place in a windowless room on the 42nd floor. My parents and Brittany sat on one side of the glass table. They looked confident, smug, even. They were wearing their best victim outfits, muted colors, anxious expressions, but I could see the greed behind their eyes. They thought they were minutes away from a check that would erase their mistakes and fund Brittany's next failure. My father, David, opened his mouth to speak, probably to launch into a rehearsed speech about healing the family rift. "Don't!" I said. I didn't raise my voice. I just held up a hand. "Nathaniel, show them." Nathaniel didn't say a word. He opened his leather folio and slid a single document across the polished glass. It wasn't a settlement offer. It wasn't a check. It was a standard government form, filled out but not yet filed. Referral for criminal investigation, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Subject, wire fraud, identity theft, and notary misconduct. Attached to the form were high-resolution copies of the loan documents with the forged signature and my mother's notary stamp circled in red. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the color drain from my mother's face. It didn't happen gradually, it happened all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. She stared at her own official seal, stamped next to a felony, and her hands started to shake. Brittany grabbed the paper. "What is this?" she snapped, trying to maintain her bravado. Then she read the header. Her breath hitched. She looked at me, then at our parents, her eyes wide with the sudden, terrifying realization that the safety net was gone. "This is leverage," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You sued me for $900,000 to cover a $72,000 fraud. You thought you could intimidate me into paying off your crime before the balloon payment hit. Jordan, please," my father whispered. His confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a small, terrified old man. We were desperate. The interest rates, we were going to pay it back. "I don't care about your intent," I said. "I care about my credit score. And my freedom. You committed a federal crime in my name." My mother started to cry ugly, gasping sobs. "We're family," she pleaded, reaching a trembling hand across the table. "You wouldn't send your own sister to prison. You wouldn't destroy us." I looked at her hand. A few weeks ago, that hand had notarized my financial ruin. I didn't feel pity. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of balancing a ledger. "I have two options prepared," I said, ignoring her hand. Option A. Nathaniel files this referral at 5 p.m. today. The FBI investigates. Mom loses her license and goes to prison for notary fraud. Brittany and Dad go down for wire fraud and conspiracy. I testify against you. Brittany let out a strangled sound, like an animal caught in a trap. Option B. I continued, my voice flat. You drop the lawsuit with prejudice immediately. You list your house for sale within 48 hours. You use the equity to pay off the fraudulent loan in full before the default date. And you sign a confession of judgment that I will hold in escrow. If you ever contact me again, or if you ever miss a deadline, I file the criminal referral. Sell the house? My mother gasped. But where will we live? That's a logistics problem, I said. I suggest you solve it. I stood up. You have 5 minutes to sign the dismissal and the agreement. If you don't, I'm walking out of here and driving straight to the field office. I watched them crumble. There was no fight left, no arrogance, just the crushing weight of consequences they had spent a lifetime avoiding. They signed the papers with shaking hands, signing away their home to save their skins. As I walked out of the room, my mother whispered my name. Jordan, how can you be so cold? I stopped at the door and looked back at them, a huddled mass of bad decisions and toxic entitlement. I'm not being cold, Mom, I said. I'm just liquidating the asset. The house sold in 48 hours. The market was hot, and they were desperate, so they took the first cash offer that covered the debt. They paid off the fraudulent loan 3 days before the balloon payment was due. They avoided federal prison, but they couldn't avoid the reality of their new life. Sarah and David moved into a 2-bedroom rental on the other side of town. Brittany declared personal bankruptcy and, last I heard, was working reception at a dental office, a job that requires her to be on time and answer to a boss. I didn't go to see them move out. I didn't drive by to gloat. I stayed at the warehouse, overseeing the expansion of our third distribution hub. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty. They ask how I can sleep at night knowing my family lost everything because I refused to help. They talk about blood and duty. But here is the truth I learned from Aunt Eleanor and confirmed in the silence of my own life. Toxic families are like ghost ships. They are unmanned vessels drifting in the dark, full of holes, taking on water. When you see one, your instinct is to pull alongside and try to save it. You want to throw a line, you want to board it, and start pumping out the water. But you can't save a ghost ship. It has no captain. It has no rudder. All it has is dead weight and momentum. If you tie your boat to it, it doesn't stop sinking. It just drags you down with it. For 30 years, I tried to bail out their water. I tried to fix their leaks with my money, my time, and my sanity. All I did was exhaust myself while they drilled more holes in the hull. Cutting the rope wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. It was physics. You cannot lift someone who is determined to stay submerged. I walked out to the loading dock one last time. The sun was setting over the industrial park, painting the concrete in shades of orange and gold. My phone was silent. My bank accounts were secure. My conscience was clear. Aunt Eleanor told me to build a fortress. I did. And standing here, inside the walls I built with my own hands, I finally realized that the greatest inheritance she left me wasn't the money. It was the permission to let them sink. If you've ever had to cut the rope to save yourself from sinking, share this story. And if you're still holding on, hoping they will change, maybe it's time to let go. Subscribe for more truths about the cost of freedom.